Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are cracking open the inner machinery of focus itself. We're asking a question you probably face, I don't know, 10 times before you've even had lunch. What truly controls your attention?
It's a huge question. We're going beneath the surface of what you think you pay attention to. I mean, if you've ever sat down to do something important, a complex task, with all the best intentions.
No, every day.
Right, maybe writing a report or trying to study something really dense, only to find yourself, like 20 minutes later, deep down some internet rabbit hole on your phone.
Then you know that attention isn't just about conscious choice.
Not at all.
Absolutely. The core challenge really is that our attention is constantly being fought over. It's like a conflict zone. It's contested every single day by external stuff, the notification that pops up, a flash of movement in your periphery.
And also by these deeply ingrained habits,
Yeah.
things driven by past rewards. And then there's that relentless, just ceaseless internal chatter that starts the second you try to find a little quiet.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to define these combatants, I guess, and figure out how we can gain a little more control over the battlefield.
Exactly. We're exploring the neurobiology, the psychology, and even some of the philosophy of attention. We'll trace the path from the most basic physical triggers, what science calls bottom-up processing, all the way to the highest, most deliberate levels of control, the top-down stuff.
And a big part of this, which I find fascinating, is how learned value past pleasure literally warps our focus in the present.
Yes. And then we'll get into whether practices like mindfulness or meditation can fundamentally recalibrate this whole system. Can they help us favor, internal stillness and intentional action?
Our sources give us some amazing clarity on the key neurological players here. We're going to unpack this critical interplay between a few networks. First, the default mode network, which is basically your restless mind.
The mind-wandering machine.
Exactly. Then there's the central executive network, which is your brain's goal setter. And of course, the surprisingly powerful role of the dopamine system in making certain distractions just completely irresistible.
It really provides a shortcut to understanding why you sometimes feel less like the master of your focus and more like a puppet whose strings are being pulled by all this learned stuff and environmental noise.
Okay, so let's start with that foundational split. Top-down versus bottom-up attention. It sounds a bit like academic jargon, but it's really just describing two radically different ways the world tries to seize control of your brain.
That's a perfect way to frame it. Think of bottom-up attention as the ultimate reactive system. It's automatic, it's driven purely by the stimulus itself, which is why you'll see researchers call it exogenous. It just happens to you.
It's reflexive, like a car backfires outside.
Exactly. If a car backfires or a brightly colored bird flies past your window or your name is suddenly called out in a noisy room, your attention is just, boom, instantaneously captured.
Yep.
Doesn't matter what you were trying to do.
It's that immediate, what was that response, right? It's not checking my to-do list. It's checking for danger, or at least novelty.
Precisely. It's evolutionarily ancient. I mean, it's what scientists call phylogenetically older, because the ability to quickly orient to something new or potentially dangerous,
A predator, a threat.
it's absolutely paramount for survival. And you can see that in its speed. It's incredibly rapid. The neural signal for this kind of capture rises by about 120 milliseconds, barely a blink, and then it falls off within about 300 milliseconds.
So it's a quick spike and then it's gone.
Yeah. This system is purely data-driven. It starts with the raw sensory input and builds up to your perception of what's happening.
So if bottom-up is the emergency reflex, then what is top-down attention?
Top-down is the thoughtful counterpart. It's voluntary, it's endogenous, meaning it originates from within you, and it's entirely goal-directed. This is the system you use when you consciously decide, okay, I'm going to focus my resources here based on an internal goal or a task.
Like trying to find a friend's face in a crowd at a concert.
Perfect example. Or you're trying to find a specific name in a long list of text. You are actively hunting for it. You're engaged in top-down control.
And that must require a much more sophisticated set of internal processes, right? It's not just a reflex. It relies on your prior knowledge like, I know what my friend looks like, and your expectations to help you interpret all that messy sensory data.
Yes, and that's especially important when the information is incomplete or ambiguous. You're using what you know to fill in the gaps. And that strategic deployment, that effort, is reflected in its timing. While bottom-up is almost instant, top-down attention takes a bit longer to get going, around 300 milliseconds.
But the big difference is that it can be sustained.
Right. Unlike the rapid decay of a reflex, the top-down signal can be sustained for as long as you need it to be, which is why you can, keep reading that complex report for hours if your internal goal is strong enough.
That difference in timing seems really key, but when you look at the results, the actual behavioral consequences, they seem to share a lot of common ground.
They do. In terms of the outcomes, both modes give you behavioral benefits. You get higher accuracy, shorter reaction times for whatever you're attending to. And on the flip side, both modes impose a cost on the things you're not attending to. It really shows that attention is a zero-sum game.
When you put resources on one thing, you're taking them from somewhere else.
You have to.
Yeah.
And neuroscientists think both modes work by biasing the competition for neural resources, usually in the visual cortex. They help determine which signal wins and gets fully processed. They even do similar things like increase your contrast sensitivity, making the thing you're looking at seem, well, sharper.
So they get to a similar place, better processing, but the way they're kicked off and controlled is totally different. Where do you see that difference most clearly in, say, a lab setting?
The contrast really shines when researchers play with something called cue validity. Top-down attention is incredibly sensitive to whether a cue is predictive. So if in a task you learn that, say, 80% of the time, the target appears on the left after you see a certain signal.
You start to anticipate it. You develop a bias to look left.
Exactly. Your performance,
Mm-hmm.
your speed, your accuracy, it all reflects that you've learned to prioritize that location. It's goal-oriented learning. You're using that slower, deliberate, predictive information to guide your attention.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the effects of bottom-up attention, that super fast capture signal, it operates pretty much independently of that. So if a really bright, irrelevant flash of light occurs on the wrong side, the automatic stimulus-driven capture still happens.
Even though I know it's probably not where I should be looking.
It doesn't matter. It happens regardless of the cue's validity. It's an involuntary, hardwired response that just temporarily steamrolls your thoughtful prediction.
It's like the old, ancient system just overrides the newer, smarter system for a split second.
That's a great way to put it.
And that brings us to one of the most fascinating structures in our sources, this kind of neural gatekeeper that is trying to mediate all this chaos. Let's talk about the pulvinar nucleus, or just the PUL.
The pulvinar is. It's just incredible. It's the largest nucleus in the primate thalamus. And if you want to understand how the brain decides what's relevant and what's not, you have to understand the pulvinar. It's critical for attention, for arousal, and most importantly, for filtering.
So you could think of it like an air traffic controller for all the sensory information streaming into the brain.
The ultimate air traffic controller, yes. Its main job is to exert what we call inhibitory control, filtering. The pulvinar is actively filtering out all the non-salient junk from the environment, the static, the irrelevant colors, the minor movements. If it wasn't doing its job, your cortex would be completely flooded all the time. Focused attention would be impossible.
So it's separating the signal from the noise. It seems like the pulvinar is mediating what gets put on the brain's priority map. It's taking the bottom-up stuff, the things that are intrinsically salient, and combining it with our top-down goals from the prefrontal cortex.
That's a highly accurate way to synthesize it. And here's where it really earns its title as a gatekeeper. The pulvinar is a key part of what's known as the pulvinolimbic pathway. This is a vital direct route that connects the thalamus straight to the limbic system, specifically to the amygdala.
The brain's emotion and threat detection center.
Right. So the implication is that the pulvinar isn't just flagging where things are, but how important they are emotionally, especially if they might be a threat.
Ah, I see.
This pathway is like a superhighway for transmitting emotionally salient and threat-related visual information. The moment you see something that even looks like danger, a shape like a snake, a sudden aggressive movement, the pulvinar has already flagged it and sent that alarm signal to the amygdala.
And that happens before you've even consciously processed what it is you're looking at.
Oh, way before. It's part of that ancient non-conscious warning system. And it explains why bottom-up attention feels so compelling and hard to ignore.
That makes the function really clear. But what happens when that structure is impaired? Our sources point to some pretty severe clinical relevance here.
Yeah, the clinical data really drives home how fundamental the pulvinar is. The sources note that alterations in pulvinar connectivity are consistently linked to a whole range of attentional and cognitive problems across a bunch of major disorders.
Can you give us a few examples? How does this trace back to a failure in filtering?
Sure. Look at a disorder like schizophrenia. Studies consistently show reduced connectivity between the thalamus and the cortex, specifically involving the pulvinar. The connections between the pulvinar and the prefrontal cortex, the area for top-down control, are often weak.
So if the gatekeeper isn't talking to the general, the whole system just descends into chaos.
That's the hypothesis.
Hmm.
If that crucial filter isn't communicating properly with the goal-setting part of the brain, the person struggles to regulate and organize their attention. Everything gets weighted equally. It could lead to the disorganized thought and inattentiveness you see in schizophrenia.
And it's a similar story for ADHD.
Very similar. Reduced pulvinar cortical connectivity is also observed in ADHD. If that gatekeeper function is weak, the brain just gets bombarded by everything, internal and external. Nothing gets filtered out as irrelevant. The system that should be prioritizing your goals is impaired because the filter isn't properly connected to the executive control center.
So the attention deficit is rooted in a failure of input control.
You could say that, and it's not just in those disorders. Even in something often seen as purely emotional, like major depressive disorder or MDD, functional studies show that the pulvinar has elevated metabolic activity compared to healthy controls.
So it's overactive.
Yes, it suggests chronic overactivity. It's not that the filter's too weak, but maybe it's constantly overflagging things, treating non-threatening or internal thoughts with this really high level of urgency. And that overactivity often comes down once antidepressant treatment starts working, which suggests the pulvinar's hypervigilant state might contribute to that constant negative internal rumination.
It just really underscores the idea that attention isn't just about willpower. It's a structural mechanism. It's about a filter and how it's regulated.
Okay, so we've established that the pulvinar prioritizes things based on physical salience, on immediate threat. But the world is full of things that aren't dangerous, but are just desirable. So let's pivot to what happens when we prioritize based on value, what the brain associates with pleasure or reward. This is where attention gets hijacked by the ghosts of past rewards.
This is so critical for understanding modern distraction. Reward learning creates these incredibly powerful attentional biases. Stimuli that were previously associated with a reward will automatically capture your attention, and they do it regardless of what you're consciously trying to do.
So a little ping sound from your phone.
Yeah.
Or that specific shade of blue from a social media icon.
Exactly. That cue has been so intensely associated with this intermittent social reward or entertainment in the past that the past pleasure demands your focus in the present, even when you're explicitly trying to focus on something else entirely. The association is so strong that the cue itself acts like a bottom-up stimulus. But instead of physical salience, its salience is purely learned value. So, can you detail the neuroanatomy of this reward system? What's driving this hijacking?
This learned salience is mainly mediated by the dopamine system. That's the fundamental mechanism for positive reinforcement and motivation. It's this cascading pathway. It starts deep in the brainstem with neurons in the ventral tegmental area, or VTA. The VTA then projects forward and activates the nucleus accumbens, the NA, in the ventral striatum.
Often called the brain's pleasure center.
Right, and that signal then continues up to higher centers like the orbital frontal cortex, the OFC, which is crucial for evaluating reward and making decisions.
So dopamine isn't just about feeling good in the moment, it's primarily the teacher. It's like a high-powered label maker going around tagging cues in your environment with, pay attention to this, it was good before, it'll be good again.
That's a perfect analogy for learned attention bias.
Yep.
But the system has a huge downside that our sources really emphasize, the undermining effect. This is the finding that anticipating or getting extrinsic rewards like money, praise, social approval can actually undermine your intrinsic self-guided motivation.
And it can reduce creativity, hurt your performance, and even decrease your overall well-being.
Exactly.
Hold on, that feels counterintuitive. If the brain's goal is to maximize reward, why would getting a reward actually make me enjoy something less or perform worse?
Because extrinsic rewards change the nature of the task. They shift the locus of control from internal to external. The focus moves away from the inherent joy of the activity itself, the intrinsic motivation, to simply getting the external payoff. It transforms an act of, say, curiosity or self-expression into just a means to an end. It reduces your sense of agency.
So the brain switches from asking, is this interesting, to what's the payout going to be?
Precisely. And that explains why an artist who loves to paint might suddenly start to hate the process when they get a commission to produce 10 identical paintings by a deadline. The payment, the extrinsic reward, has hijacked their internal motivation.
And this isn't just a psychological thing, you can see it in the brain. Which brings us to this incredible PEAT study in our source material. It links dopamine signaling directly to this involuntary capture of attention.
It was a brilliant two-phase experiment. First, participants went through a training phase. In this phase, They learned to associate specific colors, let's say a certain shade of yellow or blue, with high monetary rewards. They did this until the color itself became a deeply ingrained value cue.
So their brains basically learned this color equals money.
Exactly. Then, the next day, they came back for the test phase. Now, they had to do a completely unrewarded shape search task. They were explicitly told, color is irrelevant, ignore it.
Uh,
But some of the trials had distractors that were rendered in those previously rewarded high-value colors, and they were in a PET scanner this whole time.
the ultimate test of habit versus intention. The brain has to resist paying attention to a color that was yesterday's gold standard. What did they find?
The results were so clear. They established a direct, quantitative link between the neurochemistry and the attention failure. The magnitude of the attentional capture, so how much the irrelevant, previously rewarded colors slowed them down, correlated significantly with changes in their available D2D3 dopamine receptors. And this was in two specific regions, the right caudate and the posterior putamen.
So the physical state of the dopamine receptors in those deep habit-forming parts of the brain literally predicted how badly the person would be distracted. The strength of yesterday's pleasure predicted today's lapse in focus.
That's the crucial takeaway. It directly links striatal dopamine signaling to the involuntary orienting of attention. It proves this is a physiological bias, not just a mental mistake. And there was a vital second finding. The people who were actually good at resisting the distraction, they showed a corresponding suppression of dopamine release in those very same areas.
Wow, so this is really actionable. Resisting an urge, a notification, a craving, isn't just about forcing your attention elsewhere. It seems to involve an active neural mechanism that suppresses the value-based dopamine signal tied to the distraction.
It suggests that effective self-control requires an inhibitory capacity, a neural break. You have to be able to inhibit the feeling of importance that the cue carries with it.
Okay, so let's pivot from resisting external reward cues to generating internal ones. This leads to maybe the most mind-blowing finding in the sources, and it gets right to our core focus. If pleasure guides attention, can we steer that system towards our own internal goals? We're talking about self-stimulating the reward system through something like deep meditation.
Yes, this finding is from a case study on ecstatic meditation. It showed clear evidence that the brain's dopamine reward system can be activated by volitional mental activity alone. No external cues, no money, no food, no sensory input, just the mind.
That sounds like short-circuiting the whole evolutionary system. What's the proposed mechanism for generating this intense, self-guided pleasure?
The central hypothesis is that it comes from activating and then stabilizing a specific feedback loop between the nucleus accumbens, the NX, and the medial orbital frontal cortex, the OFC. Now, normally, this circuit is constantly being interrupted.
Because our attention is always shifting to new things in the outside world.
Correct. The visual field changes, you hear a sound, you feel the chair you're sitting on. But during this intense, focused meditation, the practitioner seems to downregulate those shifting cortical areas. This allows their attention to become super-focused, which sustains and amplifies this internal NX-OFC feedback loop.
The mind is generating its own sustained internal reinforcement. So instead of being directed outward to chase rewards, the trained mind uses attention to stabilize and amplify an internal reward state. It's literally rewarding the act of being present.
Exactly. Now, our source material is careful to note the evolutionary paradox here. Self-stimulation might seem maladaptive for survival, right? I mean, if you could generate pleasure internally, why go hunt for food or find a mate?
But in the modern environment, that capability might actually be adaptive.
Hugely adaptive. Because the modern world is saturated with easy, but often dysfunctional, reward stimulation. High-calorie food, intense media, addictive substances, all things with negative long-term consequences.
Right.
The benefit of self-generated reward, achieved through deep practice, isn't just that it stimulates the reward system without those harmful side effects. More fundamentally, it teaches the practitioner how to regulate the system, on purpose. The goal shifts from just seeking pleasure to gaining intentional control so you can focus that immense motivational power on adaptive long-term goals. The stillness provides the regulation.
Okay, so we've covered how attention is captured by stimulus and by pleasure. Now let's turn to the ultimate goal of control. Willed attention. This is the highest level of self-mastery, where you make a free internal choice about where to direct your focus.
This is a really crucial distinction, and it helps us understand the effort involved in focus. We have to separate it from instructed attention. In instructed attention, an arrow on a screen, a voice command, tells you where to focus. You still have to will yourself to follow it, but the choice is given to you. Willed attention is completely self-generated, no external cues at all.
Right, the sources talk about the experiment where the person just sees a choose prompt and then they have to internally decide, am I going to attend to the right or to the left? It's pure self-generated volition.
And when researchers compare the two using fMRI, they found something fascinating. While both instructed and willed attention lead to basically the same final neural outcome, they show very different activity patterns right around the time of the choice itself.
And what parts of the brain lit up differently?
The act of generating that free choice. The willed attention activated additional key frontal brain regions that were pretty quiet during instructed attention. These included the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, DACC, the middle frontal gyrus, MFG, and the anterior insula, AI.
Which are all parts of the brain's executive control and conflict monitoring network.
Exactly. The need to generate the choice from scratch and then commit to it just requires more cognitive overhead than simply following an order. And the DACC, in particular, had this really interesting role. The researchers called it a network allegiance shift.
Tell us more about that. What did the DACC do?
So the DACC is central to cognitive control. It's often like the alarm system that detects when things aren't going right. During instructed attention, when people were just following the arrow, the DACC clustered with the dorsal attention network, DAN, which handles top-down spatial direction. It was helping the direction system.
Its normal job, helping execute a planned action.
But during willed attention, when the brain had to make the free choice itself, the DACC shifted its primary allegiance. It started clustering with the cinguloopercular network, or CON. The CON is the stable maintenance network. It handles maintaining your focus and monitoring your performance over time.
So the DACC basically changed hats. It went from being a traffic cop for spatial attention to being a coordinator for executive function, making sure the freely chosen focus was maintained.
That's a perfect summary. It shows the brain dedicates specialized higher-level resources to carrying out a self-generated choice. And this complexity ties directly into that massive philosophical debate embedded in our source material. Free will versus free won't.
It does. For decades, neuroscience has been challenging our intuitive sense of agency. The famous studies showing that predictive brain activity can encode a decision to act up to 10 seconds before the person is consciously aware of their own intention.
The brain has literally decided before I feel like I've decided. It really undermines the idea of conscious initiation.
Right, and so that finding is the foundation for this concept of free won't.
The idea is that true freedom isn't the ability to initiate an action, the free will, because that might just arise unconsciously. Instead, freedom is the ability to override or veto an action that the brain has already initiated, the free won't. It's that inhibitory control, the capacity to say no, that represents our real agency.
But even that capacity to veto is subject to the same problem, isn't it? If the choice to veto is also encoded in the brain moments before I'm aware of it, we've just replaced one unconscious process with another.
And that's the very challenge raised in the sources. Some studies suggest that the brain states just before a decision to act or decision not to act actually look very similar. They raise the possibility that free won't may be no more free than free will. One perspective is that what we call free decisions might just be related to background stochastic fluctuations of cortical excitability.
That's a mouthful. In plain English, are we talking about random electrical noise in the brain?
Essentially, yes. It means that the final outcome of a decision might just be determined by tiny, random variations in electrical excitability in the cortex right before a threshold is met. It kind of positions our choices as the result of a neurological tiebreaker driven by random noise rather than a sovereign self making a grand decision.
And this endless inner debate, the tug-of-war between the will, the veto, the unconscious, is maybe best encapsulated when we look at the brain's default state. The restless mind and the default mode network, DMN.
The DMN is the perfect counterpoint to willed attention. Let's define it clearly. This is the brain's idle mode, the network that becomes highly active when you stop paying attention to an external demanding task.
It includes core areas like the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. When you're just sitting there letting your mind drift, the DMN is on fire.
Relentlessly busy. It's thinking about the past, simulating the future, or engaging in these intense, self-relevant, spontaneous thoughts, what researchers call stimulus-independent thought, or SIT. The thoughts are totally independent of what's happening outside of you right now.
And the DMN is defined largely by its relationship with its opposite, the central executive network, or CEN.
Correct. DMN activity is robustly anti-correlated with the CEN, so they're negatively correlated. The CEN supports attention and working memory. When the CEN is active, you're focused on a spreadsheet. The DMN has to be suppressed.
And that anti-correlation is actually a sign of a healthy, efficient brain, right?
It is. The stronger that push and pull, the better your ability to focus when you need to. When the CEN struggles to turn down the DMN, that's when you experience the heavy cost of mind wandering.
And SIT isn't some minor thing. The sources say it dominates a huge portion of our lives.
It occurs about 50% of our waking day. And while, yes, SIT can be adaptive, it can be for creative thinking or planning, it is overwhelmingly experienced as distraction, interference, or rumination. And here's the critical point. A majority of this self-generated thought is linked to negatively valenced content.
So it's not just noise, it's often negative noise.
Yes, it's linked to future unhappiness. And to maintaining psychopathology like anxiety and depression, it's this relentlessly self-referential machine trying to build our past narrative and simulate future threats. And that process often has a huge emotional cost.
The restless mind is often an unhappy mind, and it's constantly undermining our attempts at focused, willed attention, which sets up the final question for our deep dive. How can we deliberately train the mind to manage or recalibrate this default restlessness?
And this brings us to the mindful antidote, the deliberate, sustained cultivation of stability and stillness. From a classical philosophical perspective, whether it's Buddhist or Stoic, stillness provides freedom from destructive emotions, many of which are rooted in that excessive self-absorption from the DMN. The goal is to allow thoughts and emotions to just settle, like letting muddy water sit until the sediment falls to the bottom.
That analogy holds up so well. The neural studies on long-term meditators, or EMs, they bear this out. They show changes that suggest meditation isn't just a momentary trick, but a fundamental restructuring of the system. We see clear differences between state effects, what's happening during meditation, and trait effects, which are permanent changes to the brain's baseline.
Let's look at the profound trait effects first. Long-term meditators, even when they're just resting, not meditating, they show reduced functional connectivity within the DMN at baseline compared to people who don't meditate. This is the definition of a trait change. It suggests the brain's default idle mode, that self-referential machine, is just structurally quieter, less intensely connected.
That is huge. It implies the sheer need for that continuous self-narrative has been altered. The brain defaults to a quieter state, which makes focused attention easier just because there's less internal noise to fight against.
Precisely. And then what happens when they do meditate? That's the state effect. During meditation itself, these experienced meditators show increased functional connectivity in regions of the central executive network, CEN. These are the areas for deliberate, active attention control. The middle frontal gyrus, the cingulate cortex, the parietal lobule. This confirms that meditation is not passive. It's an intense, active process of attention control, even if it feels like effortless awareness.
So it's the CEN actively working over time, managing the system, constantly detecting when your mind has drifted, and then reorienting back to your focus. And this leads to another crucial concept from the sources. Mindfulness isn't just passive awareness. It involves active cognitive monitoring.
That dual nature is essential. Traditional teachings distinguish between non-conceptual awareness, or satyu, that's bare attention to the moment and discernment, or sampajaya. This discernment is the cognitive skill. It's an active, continuous appraisal of where your attention is, designed to detect when your focus is shifted. That detection allows you to reorient back to your goal.
So it's the meta-awareness, the part that notices the distraction and then re-engages willed attention. It stops the drift before it becomes full-blown mind-wandering. And that completely changes the perception of mindfulness from a passive relaxation thing to a high-level, trainable cognitive skill.
And we can see how this works in the real world, particularly in this study of counselors who practice mindfulness, which focused on the key concept of acceptance.
That study provides great context for how these abstract ideas translate into practice. The counselors were trained to cultivate acceptance not as a passive surrender, but as an interactional mode of being, a way of engaging with their own internal experience during a therapy session.
And what was so revealing was the focus of their acceptance. Their descriptions were almost entirely about their own internal experiences and reactions, their own judgment, their aversion to what the client was saying, their own distraction. It wasn't about the client's problems.
So the real challenge to acceptance wasn't the client. It was the counselor's own reaction to the client. The focus is internal. That's where the work has to happen. How did they actually do this moment to moment?
They broke it down into a series of repeatable steps, what the sources call micro-practices. First was recognizing the internal reaction, the judgment or the aversion, as soon as it arose. Second was allowing it to be there without immediately fighting it or trying to push it away.
And then, crucially, they engaged in attending to the physical, using a physical sensation like a knot in your stomach or tension in your shoulders to ground the abstract feeling in the body.
Exactly. That physical grounding is so important because it stops the mind from spinning an endless story about the feeling. And finally, these micro practices led to the twin goals of experiencing self and accepting clients. The deep understanding that to accept others, you first have to accept your own arising thoughts and feelings without judgment.
That's a brilliant framework, and it's all facilitated by three key processes.
Yes. The three facilitators are, first, decentering. That's observing your thoughts as just mental events like clouds passing, not as objective facts about reality. Second is exposure, which is just staying present with uncomfortable feelings instead of immediately trying to escape them. And third is compassion, especially self-compassion, which provides the emotional safety net that makes it possible to accept your own internal difficulties and, by extension, others.
Okay, let's try to synthesize everything now. The Pulvinar's filtering, the CEN's control, the DMN's noise, the goal of willed attention by looking at this powerful unifying theory, the attention schema theory, or AST. We started by saying attention and awareness are linked, but they're not the same thing. How does AST explain this?
AST takes a purely computational approach. It uses an analogy to model-based control. Think about the body schema. Your brain doesn't process the millions of data points from your muscles and joints in real time. That would be too slow. Instead, it builds a simplified internal model of your body, the body schema, and it uses that simplified model to control your movement efficiently.
So the brain builds a simple internal representation to control a really complicated physical system.
That's the principle. AST argues the brain does the exact same thing for attention. Attention is incredibly complex and domain general. It can focus on a sight, a sound, a feeling, a thought. To control this process, the brain constructs an attention schema, a simplified internal model of attention itself.
And here's the crucial revolutionary leap that AST proposes. This internal model of attention is what the brain experiences as subjective awareness.
That's the core argument. The content of this simplified model, the description of what your attention is focused on, how stable it is what leads the brain to conclude that it possesses subjective awareness. And this provides these elegant explanations for some huge philosophical puzzles.
Like why we're so sure awareness exists even though we can't find it in one physical spot in the brain?
Because the model doesn't represent the underlying neurons firing. It represents the function of attention in a simplified way. We are aware of the model, not the raw mechanism. It also explains why we can be aware of both external things, like sensory input, and internal things, like emotions and thoughts. Because attention itself is domain general, a model of attention would naturally have to cover both the internal and external worlds.
And the strength of the theory is that it's testable. What does AST predict about the relationship between attention and awareness?
It predicts that if awareness is a control model for attention, then attention should still be possible without awareness. But it should suffer from major deficits in control and optimization. If the model is gone, the system still runs, but it runs clumsily. And this prediction, according to our sources, is strongly supported by evidence showing that when awareness is absent, attentional control is significantly degraded.
It gives us this beautiful, complete framework. Purpose, which is top-down attention from the CEN, uses the attention schema, which is awareness, to manage the world's demands from the bottom up while constantly fighting the ghosts of past pleasures and the self-referential noise of the DMN. It shows that managing your focus is this ongoing, complex, neurological administrative task. We started this deep dive asking what truly controls your focus, and the answer is, well, you're hosting this spectacular internal neurological tug-of-war. We've seen the rapid stimulus-driven reflexes mediated by the pulvinar forcing our attention bottom up.
And we've explored the long-term intentional control exerted by the central executive network, especially through the complexity of willed attention. And we discovered how past pleasure, mediated by striatal dopamine, creates these powerful involuntary biases, hijacking your attention towards learned cues. But crucially, we've seen that self-generated acts, like focused meditation, offer a path to self-regulation, not just self-stimulation, by stabilizing those internal reward loops.
The ultimate synthesis, and maybe the greatest relief, lies in cultivating stillness and discernment. The restless mind, the DMN, is responsible for about half of our waking day spent lost in thought, and a lot of that is negative. We saw that long-term training can actually reduce DMN connectivity at its baseline, a fundamental trait effect that just quiets the noise.
So here's the final provocative thought for you to carry forward, tying all this together. The DMN is fundamentally defined by continuous self-referential narrative processing. Past, future, me, mine. If long-term attentional training, the kind that cultivates stillness, causes the DMN to become permanently less active at rest, does this neurological shift from state to trait suggest that sustained attention fundamentally alters the necessity of that continuous self-narrative? Is the brain, through mindful attention and the control afforded by the attention schema awareness itself, learning to operate with more clarity, less cost, and less anxiety? Because it's simply generating less noise about the self.
It makes you wonder if the ultimate cognitive shortcut to a better, more intentional life is simply building a better, more accurate model of your own attention. How much time are you going to spend perfecting that model today?
Something potent to reflect on as you navigate the noise and the demands of the world.
This has been The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.